This is an example of how we might annotate and plan ideas for a Hamlet interpretive analysis question. So here is the statement in the question. The greatest tragedy is not that Hamlet dies, but that his act of revenge is ultimately so pitiful and desperate. So there's two key things I need to highlight here to make sure I'm clear about my focus. The first is the argument. So I need to highlight greatest tragedy because that is the evaluative statement in this phrase so that I know exactly what I need to focus on and evaluate. And I will highlight not that and but that to remind me that I'm given one statement that I'm supposedly supposed to support being negated and one statement that I'm supposed to be supporting being asserted. Now, obviously I then have the opportunity to decide whether or not I agree with that angle, but I'm able to see exactly what the focus is if I highlight those two things. So if I now switch colour and focus on what it is that's being asserted, it is not that Hamlet dies, so I'll highlight Hamlet dies in one colour, and then I will highlight his act of revenge, ultimately so pitiful and desperate. So you can see there that I've now been able to pick out for myself that there's two clear focuses. It's the focus on Hamlet's death and the nature of that as a tragedy, and there is Hamlet's act of revenge and whether or not it is ultimately pitiful and desperate. Now, the logical thing for me to then do is to pick out these particular words and consider why they may be a tragedy anyway. So if I take Hamlet's death, for example, and I'm going to come and bring some notes down here on this, obviously there's the obvious in the sense of loss and inevitable downfall. There's that the question sort of justice that come around his death, whether he felt that ultimately he needed to die if he was killing somebody else, as he battles with the whole morality of the issue earlier in his soliloquies. There is obviously the escalation of suffering that we see in the finale in particular. This is a tragedy. These deaths spreads from the initial death that we didn't even see in the play of Hamlet's father. We now at the end have Hamlet as one of many deaths, so that's clearly a big tragedy. And also that sense that Hamlet sort of never replaces his father as king. So there's the tragedy of the failure to succeed his father and the fact that ultimately he simply dies having taken revenge. Is that a success? Has he fulfilled his father's wishes? Or ultimately is it a sort of unnecessary loss and failure? I'm now going to switch colour to then focus on the other aspect. His act of revenge is ultimately so pitiful and desperate. Now, first of all, I'd like to pick out this aspect of act of revenge. So obviously I can look at the final blow that he delivers to Claudius, but it is worth considering that this act of revenge is something that in many ways is spread throughout the play. We have the play that he does, to catch the conscience of the king. That is part of his act of revenge. We have his use of the antic disposition in order to cast himself in a particular light, a particular character, in order to sort of try and grapple with this revenge or identity. We have his Polonius murder as well, which is part of the act of revenge. Does he think he's actually taking revenge in that moment? So it does spread a little bit beyond just simply the final moment where he takes revenge and considers him a little bit more in terms of being a revenger. And then if I just clarify this a little bit further by switching colour again for the last part of that statement, his act of revenge is ultimately so pitiful and desperate. So with this particular bit, we're questioning, since I suppose of how he kills Claudius is obviously the main focus of this, the fact that it is it's impulsive and instinctive, which goes completely against how he had orchestrated everything else before. It seems to be reactive. So he's in that situation as being pushed into this. Is it pitiful and desperate, though? Is this too harsh a judgment? That's what I want to question when I come to this to fully answer it. Does he react ultimately and do the only thing he can? Is there a sense in which he acts because he has no choice? Was there inevitability that it was always going to be quite a messy end in many ways? Were we ever really going to get the true finale that we were hoping for? And as we talked about, the way that we've ultimately got a Laertes versus Hamlet duel at the end, rather than the Claudius versus Hamlet duel, in some ways we can sort of say that the play's structure, the way that Shakespeare's orchestrated this, has led us to quite a pitiful ending, in the sense that we do not have the hoped-for moment of revenge and confrontation between the two. Now, you'll notice as well that in the wording of the question, we are reminded that we must look at different interpretations with reference to different interpretations. So I'm just highlighting that there. In fact, I'll just circle that bit as well so we can see that even more clearly. So with this, see, that is partly going to be accomplished. I'll just draw a link to the word greatest there, by the fact we're going to evaluate whether or not the greatest tragedy is his death, or the fact that ultimately his act of revenge doesn't have quite the glory and the perfect orchestration that we may have expected it to have, or hoped that it would have, and that his father certainly seemed to expect it to have. However, does necessarily an act of revenge have to play out in that particular way? He managed to kill Claudius. Doesn't that simply fulfill his father's wishes, regardless of the way in which it came about? So that's going to be partly what we engage with interpretations, but it's also going to be things to do with why does Hamlet act as he does. So you can see how actually, although this looks like it's a focus just on the final scene, this is actually going to broaden itself to look at some of his soliloquies, going to look at the moment when he could have taken revenge when Claudius was praying, and to consider ultimately why Hamlet chooses to act when he does and how he does. And this potentially then leads you to look at changing interpretations over time. You may be able to look at what Ernest Jones has said about how he couldn't kill Claudius without killing himself, so maybe that is why Hamlet does need to die at the end. And you'll be able to look at different ideas perhaps over time about Hamlet's role and what it is ultimately that causes his struggle to fulfill that identity. So that is the overview of the question, and hopefully that's provided you with a sense of how you may annotate and plan this, that you could then tackle it.